I'm trying to get with Dr. Frank Turk on his podcast. He does every Thursday night. He does a live podcast where you can do Q&A. I'm trying to get into asking a question and can't get in. Live? All right. Welcome back, everyone. This is session 4 for Evidence of God for Skeptics. And tonight we're covering macroevolution, or evolution. My name is Fred Mastro, and I might have not made it clear in previous sessions, but everything I talk about tonight, and I tell you tonight, all right, do your own research. Don't take my word for it, right? I am nobody. I know my research, but do your own evidence, right? Fact check. So a lot of the material and content you see tonight will be coming from a book by Norman Geisler and Dr. Frank Turek. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. You'll see a lot of reference material from here. Ultimately, this whole session is kind of going through an outline based on this book. So the questions we've been trying to answer over the last few sessions and sessions coming up are, if we can answer the affirmative to 4 questions, right, then we know that the Bible is true, that God is true, all Christianity is true. And those 4 questions are, 1, does truth exist? Right, does truth exist? We covered this in session 1. Right, does truth exist? If someone says truth does not exist, right, well then that's a self-defeating claim, right? Because if truth does not exist and that statement's true, then truth does exist, so truth not existing doesn't exist, right? So it's a self-defeating claim. We cover that in session 1. What we learn is truth is absolute. Truth is true for all people at all times and all places. The second question, if we can answer the affirmative to, does God exist, right? Does God exist? What's the evidence behind that? And so you'll see from the last session 1, 2, and 3, we go through evidence of why we believe God exists. What's the evidence behind it? The beginning of the universe, as atheists all agree, even, that the universe had a beginning, came from nothing. All time, space, and matter came into existence all at once. And so something had to have created it, right? Because it was created. And whatever that thing is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, because it lives outside of this universe in order to create it, right? It's all powerful, it's personable, because it had to make a conscious decision to create something out of nothing, right? We believe that's one point of evidence for God. We then got into the teleological argument that in session 2, that the universe appears to be designed for human life, right? Over 1,000 known fine-tuned parameters that if you were to change any one of these parameters, life as we know it would cease to exist. Advanced life, civilization would cease to exist. And so the universe appears to have been designed for human life. And because it seems it's designed, we believe that that's evidence for a designer. Third session, we talked about the origin of life. Right? No one can answer the origin of life in the scientific community. There's not even a working theory. Right? But we learn about DNA. We learn about messages in DNA. We learn about the data within DNA. We look at the data of a single cell, right? Over 1,000 volumes of encyclopedias worth of data. More complex than any man-made machine. Irreducible complexity, meaning you have to have all the pieces in place. You cannot gradually grow into life or a cell. Right? It's an error-correcting digital code. Can't happen by randomness. We looked at the mathematical probabilities of that. And requires a designed language, which we know that language only comes from a mind, which we talked about. Right? And so we went over some of the mathematical impossibilities of the large numbers of chances of life coming into existence. So that was session 3. The third question that we would want to answer in the affirmative are miracles, right? And that's a question we'll answer in a future session coming up. And then, is the New Testament true? Which is another question we'll answer in future sessions. So if you can answer yes to the 4 questions, is there truth? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament true? Then the Bible is true. Right? Christianity is true. And the reason why we don't mention the Old Testament is because Jesus taught from the Old Testament. The New Testament references the Old Testament. So basically, if you prove the New Testament to be true, you get the Old Testament for free thrown in. So tonight we're on session 4, right? Macroevolution, some evidence that points to a God. And let's get into it. So evolution. So what is evolution? If someone says, I believe in evolution, I don't believe in evolution, we believe in evolution, right? The first thing you should ask is, what do you mean by that? Because if you mean change over time, right? Then life is different now than it was a long time ago, then I agree with you, right? That evolution is true, that is true. We see that, we observe that. So if you mean evolution has changed over time, then everyone would agree with you on that. If you mean change over time, modest, even observable changes within species, right, cyclical variations, there we would agree with you as well. Micro changes within a species. There you have modest changes or changes within a species, right, and we observe that and we see that over time. So we would agree on that statement, if that's what you meant by evolution. Third is common ancestry theory, that there's a universal ancestry or limited groups are all related, the Darwinian view of the tree of life, that we all came from the same source. Right? You might mean evolution by that, common ancestry. Right? And then there's the unguided, undirected process, natural selection acting on random mutations responsible for all the life we see with the appearance of design. Right? One species becoming a new species, that's macroevolution. Right? And that's where we would disagree. That macroevolution, there's no evidence, and what you'll see tonight, not a single piece of evidence to support macroevolution. There's some evidence to support, and there's some evidence that you could use to support common ancestry, but we'll talk about that as well. But there's no evidence that we've seen that points to a macroevolution. Now keep in mind, it's that we're saying that it's, or Darwinians say that it's unguided, undirected process responsible for all the life with the appearance of design, but that it's not design, right? That's their argument. Caveat to this, right? If evolution was true, not that I believe it is, you'll see based on the evidence, but if it was true, Christianity would still be true. Christianity isn't based on the Bible. Christianity is based on an event that happened in history, right? There would be some biblical inerrancy, right? We might find that the Bible is off, maybe, or a little wrong in some terms. We might think that we've misinterpreted if evolution was true. Doesn't affect God. God would still exist. If anything, you need more reason to have God for if you have evolution. And Jesus still rose from the dead. So even if evolution was true, it wouldn't affect Christianity in any way. It wouldn't affect Jesus rising from the dead. It wouldn't affect that a God exists, right? But we don't believe it's true, and we'll show you the evidence for that. So 1912, the Piltdown Man, right? The British Museum reconstructed fragments of a skull and jawbone and hailed it as the link between the ape and man. They said this is the missing link, right? And they reconstructed the skull, and from 1912 to 1923, for 11 years, they titled this as proof of evolution, right? In 1923, it was revealed to be a hoax. What they found was the combination of the human skull and orangutan jaw with chimpanzee teeth, right? And the scientific didn't concede it until 1953. They finally acknowledged it. It took 30 years for the scientific community to admit this was not the missing link. So think about that if you were alive during that time when it was discovered. 1923, 1912, proof that evolution exists. And now you're being told that evolution is true. And then in 1923, they discover it to be a hoax. And then for another 30 years, not until 1953, does the scientific community concede. Some of you might be familiar with this diagram or a diagram like this, right, where an ape changes into a man over time. The only true images on these diagrams is the first and the last. All the images in between, a lot of people would think are based on some type of scientific evidence. They're in our textbooks when we talk about evolution. There is zero evidence for any of the other transitional phases in between. It's 100% guesswork. All the diagrams you see are 100% guesswork. There is no science backing any of those transitions. Other proofs of evolution, the Lucy, right? The Lucy ape, the Lucy animal we discovered was all experts agree was a 3-foot tall chimpanzee. Some of you might be familiar with some of these. The Heidelberg man was built from a jawbone that conceded by many to be very human, right? Wasn't a proof of evolution. The Nebraska man, right? They found this single tooth, and they said this is the missing link. And from this single tooth, they built up a whole skull, scientifically built up a skull and a jawbone, and then later they found that tooth to be from an extinct pig. Right? The Piltdown man we just talked about, the Peking man supposedly was 500,000 years old, and all the evidence for this has disappeared. No one can find any evidence for this piece of evolutionary evidence. Neanderthal man was studied by Dr. A.J.E. Cove and several others, and after examination they found that the skeleton was just an old man. Every single piece of evolutionary evidence that has ever been touted as the missing link has been found to be false, right, invalid, or bad experimentation, or bad examples of science. Anthony Flew was the greatest philosophical atheist in the last century. Right? He said he would always follow the evidence wherever it leads him. He was such an atheist that he wrote the Atheism in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Right? He's the one that they had write this section on atheism. He was the atheist hero of the last century. In the early 2000s, he followed the evidence for DNA and became a deist. That's someone who believes that God created the universe, but has left it and stepped away, let us run it, right? And he said there must be an intelligence out there based on the evidence he found, that it led him to wrote the book, There Is a God. And what did all his atheist colleagues and atheist friends, and he was the atheist hero, what did they all say about him? They said, oh, he's just old and senile, right? The minute he realized he followed the evidence and came to that conclusion, they just called him senile. Some of you, may be familiar with the global warming hockey stick. You're like, how does this relate to evolution? But you'll kind of see. So this is they call the global warming hockey stick, and you can look it up and Google it, and you'll see that they show trending of the date of the temperatures going down, and then this huge spike where you see the red going up. Well, it turns out it's not true. It turns out that the scientists were cherry picking the data to show that what they wanted to show, and they tricked or hid the decline and made it look like it was going up instead of down. Some claim that they used defective algorithms, and anyone who dissented or spoke out against how they presented the data was blacklisted from their communities. The same thing is going on today with macroevolution. Right? If you watch the movie Expelled with Ben Stein interviewing Richard Dawkins and going around to the academic schools, the movie is not about evolution, the movie is about academic freedom. And when they show in the movies that anyone who touts any other view besides evolution gets canceled on their tenure, gets kicked out of the schools, gets kicked out of academia, suggesting there might be an alternate theory based on the evidence. Right? So you'll find this going on, the same exact thing in the world of evolution. And all this is to point out, to remind everybody from the last time we talked about remember the O.J. Simpson trial, is that science doesn't say anything. Science is the data. Science is the data that we look at. It's the scientists who interpret the data that say something, right? And it's only as objective of the scientists themselves. All right, scientists interpret the data with their worldviews. And the goal that I hope that people can use based on this evidence is try to, not look at this with your worldviews, but look at it at a clean slate. If you were looking at this, what does the data show? Right? And you'll see from some of the things I'll show you that the scientific community is just as built on faith and their stubbornness of their views of the world on how they come to their own conclusions. So there's two main arguments for evolution. Mainly two arguments. One is that small adaptations or microevolution leads to new species over time. So small adaptations of a species, given enough time, adapts them enough where eventually it's a new species. And even the word species is controversial, like depending on how we define species. The easiest way I like to define it is a species cannot breed with another species. So a cat can't breed with a dog can't breed with a bird can't breed with a snake. Right? That's one way to define species. But if you talk about species or you talk about animal types, you'll find controversy around how they define that to get around some of this if they can. So the one argument is that small adaptations over a long period of time leads to macroevolution or new species. The second argument they make is that similarities in structure of DNA are evidences for a common ancestor. So we'll talk about both of these arguments. So dog breeding, right? You see this a lot when people talk about evolution. Evolution is true. Why? Because look at the dogs that we can get from one pair of dogs. From one set of dogs, you can get all the other dogs. Right? I think Neil deGrasse Tyson, he he shows this on his Cosmos video. Have you ever watched that? He's like, we know evolution is true, and what's the picture they show? It's dog breeding, right? And there is proof of microevolution. There's proof that if you take a dog, you can get all the other variations of dogs, right? But jump from this to macroevolution. They say because microevolution is true, well, the macroevolution is true. Right? And they just make the jump without any actual evidence behind it. So you'll see something like this, like the origin of life, and you'll see all life coming out of one place, and it's all related, and that we're related to plants, and we're related to all the other things on the tree of life. Right? But what do they fail to notice? All the dog breeding that goes on. It's still a dog. Right? Every single microevolution or evolution evidence that they find. And if you think about it, you have breeders, highly intelligent breeders, are trying to get very specific traits out of their animals. They're trying to push the genetic limits, and with using all our intelligence, right, of breeders, they do everything they can, they still hit genetic limits. They can only make a dog so big. They can only make a dog so small, right? They can only work within the genetic limits of that species. And scientists are finding that within the DNA, within a species, there are genetic limits, right, that you can't go outside. You can't go outside the bounds of the bounds of those. So, which makes more sense? So, intelligent meets genetic limits, right? With our intelligence, we can't break the genetic limits of DNA within a species. Yet, somehow, through a non-intelligent process, an unguided process, we get all the species of the animals, right? Through non-intelligence. So, what do they say to counteract that? They say, give it more time, right? Give it more time, and eventually, somewhere down the road, that'll happen. If you're familiar with nature, you realize that that will never happen. Nature is more chaotic given more time. We went through this example last time where if a plane flies over your house at 10,000 feet and drops red, white, and blue confetti out of a plane, the chances of it landing into a flag and forming a flag at your house is impossible, right? The probability of that, of all landing and forming the U.S. flag, would be impossible. So what do they say? Give it more time. So that means that'd be the same thing as taking the plane. Instead of 10,000 feet, now you fly it at 20,000 feet or 50,000 feet, right? Do you think more time of a better chance of it landing into a flag? Right? No, the more time you give it, the more chaotic it's going to be. The less likely it's going to form into something, right? But they tried this. They tried this with fruit flies because fruit flies have a small lifespan. So they did thousands and thousands and thousands of generations of fruit flies. And what they're able to do, they're able to mutate the fruit flies, yes. They can create mutant fruit flies. They're able to create fruit flies where the wings come out the forehead. They're able to create fruit flies that can fly or breathe in different air density type of space. Right? But in the end, what are they still? Fruit flies. Right? They're not a new species. It's still fruit flies. And no matter what they do, the fruit fly DNA genetic limits cannot create something that the fruit fly doesn't already know about. Right? You're not going to get. You can't get a fingernail or a fish scale or a bird feather out of the fruit fly if it's not already in the DNA in that for that species, right? So it's scientifically, physically impossible for it to generate a different type of part that doesn't already exist. There's a doctor, he's been working on E. coli bacteria for 30 years, right? And he's able to get micro changes in this bacteria. 30 years of working E. coli bacteria is equivalent to 1 million years of human evolution because the E. coli bacteria lifespan is so short. And in the end, what does he still have? E. coli bacteria, right? Yes, he's able to get some mutant changes. Yes, he's able to get some modifications, but there's evidence for that. We see that, right? But how do you make the jump from that to macroevolution, right? There's no evidence to support that. What's interesting is, you remember Charles Darwin originally came up with this theory because he saw the finches and he saw that their beak lengths were different, or depths and widths were different. And that was where he based his microevolution theory and then based his macroevolution theory on origin of life. But what they found was that changes, the theory of natural selection is that, natural selection decides which animals die, which animals live, and then life moves forward from that point. But we find that through science, natural selection is cyclical, not directional, meaning it comes and goes and it's affected by the weather and by the environment. What they found was during the dry years, the finches' beaks got bigger because they had to dig farther to get seeds. During the wet years, the beaks got smaller because they didn't have to dig as far. And then when dry season came back, the beaks got bigger, and then smaller, and then bigger, and smaller. Natural selection is cyclical, right? It changes based on the environment, but it's not a directional type of change, right? And natural selection and evolutionary can't answer the question, where did the finches come from, right? Natural selection can answer the how a species survives, but not necessarily where it actually comes from, right? So we find that the natural selection is a cyclical process. If you look at your textbooks in evolution, you'll find something about the peppered moth. Some of you might be familiar with, depending on when you last were in school, right? But they still show the peppered moths as evidence of evolution and natural selection. And it's not this picture, but they show a picture of the moths on a tree bark. And what they say is this is an example of natural selection at its finest, perfect example of evolution at work. And if you're not familiar with it, basically the argument is that there was a bunch of trees and there was white and black moths, and then the industrial revolution came in and got soot on all the trees, and all the trees got dark and blackened. And because of that, they said birds would eat the white moths because the white moths were more visible on the bark, and so only the black moths survived. And so all the white moths were made extinct, and only the black moths were left. Depending on what book you read on evolution, on your textbooks, it'll stop right there, right? That's the proof. The end, right? Stops. When the Industrial Revolution, when they actually passed decades later air pollution bills, they got rid of all the soot in the air, the trees became white again. And guess what? The white moths appeared back again because natural selection is cyclical, right? It comes and goes. And then they found that the images for the peppered moths on the tree bark were doctored. Scientists actually glued them to the tree bark because the moths don't naturally exist on the tree bark. They normally hide up in the trees and stuff. And then the scientists doing the experiment would release all the moths right on top of the tree bark right before sunrise without the moths getting a chance to get acclimated and go hide in their normal routines. And so, yeah, the birds would come and eat all the moths all right there. And so the whole experiment basically is inconclusive, right? It's not proof of natural selection. It's not proof of evolution, right? And so the whole peppered moths thing, but if you read it in a textbook today, it'll say proof of evolution, proof of natural selection. But there's a whole other story behind it they don't go into. So natural selection can explain the survival of a species, but not the arrival. Right? Natural selection can explain the survival of a species, but not the arrival of a species. Right? We can rule that one out. Let's look at, and we'll show more evidence for that later too with the fossils and stuff. Let's look at similarities in structure. So Philip Johnson, he wrote a book called Darwin on Trial. And he's not a biologist, he's a lawyer. And he realized there was problems with macroevolution because they're not based on evidence, they're based on logic. So he was noticing that the scientific community was arguing for macroevolution, but not based on actual evidence, just based on logic and flawed logic and flawed interpretation. And being a lawyer, he dug into it and then ended up writing the book Darwin on Trial when he realized that there's no evidence for it. It's just this cyclical reasoning that they're using. So Philip Johnson sent Richard Dawkins, one of the biggest atheists today, and he asked him, "What's your number one piece of evidence for macroevolution? Tell me what is it? What's your number one piece of evidence for macroevolution?" And he says, "The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals." So what he's saying is we all have DNA, it all looks similar, and so we all come from common ancestry, and so macroevolution is true. All right, well, let's look at some of that, right? So we all have DNA. Let's look at the data. The DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans. And even that number is controversially too high. I think it's actually lower than that. Percent between mice and humans. Right? It takes a small amount of DNA change to make big changes in the species. Right? To make big changes in a species. What best explains the data? The data shows that we have a common genetic code. Right? That's what the data shows. We have a common genetic code. So there's two answers to that. Either we have a common ancestor, so maybe Richard Dawkins is right, because no one was there, no one really knows. Right? Or we have a common designer and creator, right? Because you find that when you notice people's art, right? You'll notice a designer's piece of work because they use similar style and structure. Right? The reason why I think it's more of the designer and creator, because then you take in all the other things we talked about, the beginning of the universe, the design of the universe, right? So, but animals, also would fit within that designer. But Darwin we're related to the bee, we're related to the mildew on a plant, we're related to the Venus flytrap, we're related to the octopus and the peacock and plants, right? How do they explain that, right? There's no evidence for this. You're related to a roach, right? This is disgusting, all right? And he goes on, right? Richard Dawkins wasn't done when he said that. He said, because of the similarities to genetic code, and then he says, my philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true. Right, what does that mean? That means he has a philosophical commitment. He does not believe in any type of intelligence, does not believe in a God. He believes everything happened through natural causes, right? And he says it's true. That is my belief. Going into anything he looks at, he comes with this worldview automatically, right? But I would prefer to characterize it as a philosophical commitment to real explanation as opposed to complete what you espouse. Right? He's ruling out intelligent design or intelligence beforehand, assuming what he's trying to prove. Right? And that's what you'll find all the scientists are doing. It can't be, I only believe in natural selection, or I only believe in natural causes, materialism. So when I look at the evidence, biology, it looks designed. Universe, it looks designed. But it's not designer, because I already know that. So it's got to be something else. I just don't know what it is, but it's definitely not a designer. And that's how they look at it. And then you have the apologetics on our side. All we're saying is look at the evidence. All we're saying is follow the evidence, and does it a designer make more sense than what the answer you're providing for evolution, right? Darwinians can't answer where DNA came from. We talked about the last time, the origin of life. DNA, complex software, man machine, 3 billion letters long, and in any other order, right, life ceases to exist. And then we know that language comes from a mind. Message never comes through natural processes don't create messages. It takes more faith to believe that species and life and DNA all came from an undirected natural force. Right? It's not about religion versus science, it's about bad science versus good science. Francis Crick here, right, he says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Think about that. The biologists have to constantly remind themselves, this is not designed. It looks designed, appears designed, but it's evolved. And then Philip Johnson, responding to that note, says, Darwinian biologists must keep repeating that reminder to themselves, because otherwise they might become conscious of the reality that is staring them in the face and trying to get their attention. Right? All the evidence points towards some type of designer. So when we say intelligent design or intelligent designer, a lot of people think that as a religious term. It's, you're intelligent design, that's because you don't believe in science. You're believing in religion without faith. That's not what that means at all. Right? Intelligent design is not about religion. It's about science. It's about certain features of life and the universe are better explained by having an intelligent mind behind it. Intelligent design states that the science shows that intelligence is a better explanation than natural selected or unguided, undirected processes. That's intelligent design. It's not saying that we don't believe in science. It's saying the data shows it's more likely to come from a designer than some unguided process, right? And look at the data. The other argument for evolution is homology. Homology says, does the similarity of structure prove a common ancestor? And you'll see something like this where here's a human arm, here are the bones of a human arm, right? And then you find similar bones like that in a cat, and you find similar bones in a whale or in a bat, right? And so they say that's because we're all came from the same, tree of life. Right? If you look at this diagram, this is Haeckel's embryos. Each vertical column here is a different species, and he drew this and created it and sent it out there, and it was proof of evolution, proof of common ancestry. And then they found out that these were all faked, that he made all these up. He doctored all these images to make them all appear similar, right? And so it turned out to be a hoax. This is why when you read about something in evolution, someone's like, we have proof of evolution. They're probably talking about microevolution, or they're talking about something like this that's been debunked, right? The similarity of structure proved that the pot evolved from a teaspoon. right? Pull this out of the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, but this is what they'll say. It's like, oh, see the similarity of structure? So that means the pot evolved from the teaspoon, right? Darwinian Tim Barra presented this as evidence for descent with modification. He said, look at the Corvette, which is at the bottom there, and then look at the 1963 and the 1968 Corvette, the 1978 Corvette. This is proof of, this is exactly what the way evolution works, right? How they all been modified and get better over time. What was his thing that he was, what's the point, what was the thing he's missing here? How did that happen? Anyone guesses? Yeah, it required a designer. It required an intelligent mind in order to make those changes. Right? It was then called Barra's blunder because he presented an argument that worked against him and better argued for intelligent design. Right? You'll see common designs in everything. All right? If it's a good design, it's a good design. There's a reason why cars have 4 wheels, right? Because it just works. Doesn't mean all these cars came from the same car. Right? So homology doesn't prove common ancestry. It could be a common designer. Right? So yes, we don't know. We weren't there. But when you look at all the evidence in totality, it's like there's no evidence for macroevolution. There's design evidence in DNA. There's design evidence in biology. And so if you have a common designer, that better fits all the evidence. So what do? They argue it with circular reasoning. They say, they say common DNA and homology proves that we have a common ancestor. And we say, well, why not a common designer? And they say, because macroevolution is true. And then we say, well, how do you know macroevolution is true? And they say, because we have common DNA and homology. Right? And it's circular reasoning. That's what Richard Dawkins used. He said, because of common DNA and homology. But there's no proof that means common ancestry. That could mean common designer. So some evidence against gradualism, right? Gradualism is that microevolution changes over time and all the transition phases required. We have irreducible complexity, which we'll talk about, and the fossil record. So let's talk about the fossil record. There's something called the Cambrian Explosion, right? Cambrian Explosion. So what they found was there's a layer within the planet and the stratosphere of Earth, the layer within the Earth, and Charles Darwin was there too when this was discovered. A ton of fossils are found all at once. A bunch of different species of fossils are found all at once, and it's throughout the globe, in China and the US, everywhere. And they all seem to come to existence at once, all within the same layer. What they expected was something like this, where given over time, the blue line would be gradual discoveries of animals coming into existence. What they find instead is a huge spike. All the animals come into existence, and then no more are found. And the couples trickle in over time, little by little by little. Right? Cambrian Explosion. It was a huge doubt that Charles Darwin had about this. Richard Dawkins says, again, atheist, the Cambrian strata of rocks are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And when we find many of them already in the advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Right? It just appears that way, but it can't be true. Right? Dawkins would come in with that's not true because he already has a materialistic view on everything. Charles Darwin said he was aware of the Cambrian Explosion. He was actually there as a young professor. He said it presented a challenge to his theory. But he felt okay about his theory because he predicted that as more fossils were discovered over time, evidence supporting gradualism would be discovered, right? We would find transition bones, transition fossils, and so forth. Today, the fossil record is more complete than ever before, and not one single piece of evidence supporting Darwin's theory has ever been found. And when Darwin made the theory, he didn't know about DNA, he didn't know about the complexity of a cell, that's like a blueprint factory, he didn't have all the science and evidence that we have today. Right? The real tree of life is not like this, as we see in a lot of different diagrams. The real tree of life is like blades of grass. It's like you see all these species, they just appear, and they're variations within that species, but they never cross. You never see anything that connects the branches of a species, right? The real tree of life. And Dawkins says, without gradualness, we are back to a miracle. So because there's no evidence of transitional fossils, because we can't find anything to support macroevolution, right? Stephen Gould came up with a new theory. He said, it's punctual punctual evolution, meaning they didn't transition over a long period of time. They transitioned almost instantly into new species, right? There's no evidence for that either, but that was the excuse of why there's no transition boats. And he says, the extreme rarity of the transitional forms in the fossil record persist as the trade secret of paleontology. Right? Think about it, it's the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and the nodes, meaning the tree of life that you see, the only data that's real is the ends, right, where all the actual animals, full animals exist. The rest is inference. The rest is guesswork. However reasonable, not the evidence of fossils, right? And he's an atheist. He's trying to prove evolution is true. He's saying that the paleontologists know there's no transition bones. It's a trade secret. They don't tell you, they don't talk about it. And all those tree of life things are made up and they're not even based on science. National Geographic had a magazine in 2004. They said, illuminating with spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution, from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. Think about that. You go to see a movie, and every 999 frames is missing, right? So you only have every 1,000th frame. You're going to leave that movie with a complete understanding what the plot was and what was going on? Like, no, right? You can be totally confused, right? But yet, that's what they say, oh, fossils show proof of evolution, but there's none there to be seen. So then we ask the question, what would the fossil record look like if creation was true? You know what it would look like? Exactly the way it does today, right? It's like the way you see it today. Bang, a bunch of animals suddenly appear with no precursor, right? The way that it looks today is the way it would exactly look if creation was true. So I got a video here from Incredible Creatures. This is a 2-minute clip on irreducible complexity. We talked about irreducible complexity in previous sessions, but this is just one example of the animals in biology that fit. There's so many of them, right? But fit this thing called irreducible complexity. I'll kind of show this to you.
A bull giraffe is about 18 feet tall. In order to get blood up that long skinny neck against gravity, the bull giraffe has to have a powerful pump, and that's his heart. And the heart of a bull giraffe can be as much as 2.5 feet long. Big, powerful pump. Now, as he's going along here, living his life, everything's just fine, but all of a sudden, this 18-foot tall creature decides, I need a drink of water. So he bends his head down to get a drink of water. Now we have a problem. Because now this powerful pump, instead of pumping against gravity, is pumping with gravity. And so the heart gives a mighty squeeze, and the blood shoots down his neck, hits his brain, and bursts his brain. And so now he just blew his brains out, okay? So he's dying, and he must be thinking to himself, I need to evolve something here to take care of my problem. When I get a drink of water, I blow my brains out. Of course, we know dead creatures don't evolve. But he doesn't blow his brains out, because as he bends his head down, there are like little spigots in his artery that goes up the neck, little valves, and they close. But the last pump is beyond the last valve. And so it's enough to burst the little arterioles in his brain, but it doesn't go into his brain. The last pump kind of goes whoop underneath the brain into like a sponge. And this sponge just gently expands, and he hasn't blown his brains out. He gets his drink of water, and now he sees a zebra kind of running up from this side, and he just ignores it. But he sees a lion coming up from this side. Oh, the lion wants to eat me. I got to get out of here. Now, how does he know the difference, by the way? Evolutionists can't explain that to us. But the fact is, here comes this lion. He's going to eat a giraffe. And so the giraffe jumps up. He runs about 5 steps, passes out. Not enough oxygen in his brain. While he's there, passed out, the lion is eating him. He must be thinking, I need to evolve something here. I got this problem. I pass out when I get up too fast. But he doesn't, of course. Well, why? Well, because God made him so that when he begins to bring his head up, the little spigots, the little valves in the artery open, the sponge under the brain gently squeezes that last little pump of oxygenated blood up into his brain. There are little valves in the vein that goes down the neck, they close, and by the time he's up and running, everything is fine, his blood pressure is fine, and he does just fine. Well, how would that evolve? He needs all of those parts, all there, all at the same time, all at once, or he's dead. And so I think the giraffe is another example of a designer. He needed a designer to design him just like he is.
right? And that's just one of many, many animals. If you look into the biology of animals, that you have irreducible complexity, right? And you have to have all the pieces in place in order for it to work. You can't gradually come into existence, right? So it's good science versus bad science. It's not religion versus science. It's just follow the evidence. What does the evidence show? Using the same scientific method that Darwin used, we can use to show proof of intelligent design. It's about reasonable faith versus unreasonable faith, right? It requires more faith to believe that all this happened by something I thought about was, even in the Bible, John 20, 30, 31, right? He says why they wrote these things of miracles and Jesus and many other signs that truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, he did, which are not written in this book. But these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. Meaning they wrote these things down so that you would have evidence, not blind faith, which is not nobody's asking for blind faith. We're asking for, look at the evidence. What does the evidence show? Right? And I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I don't have enough faith to think that unguided natural process cause all the species of life, right, to come into existence. Right? The evidence shows that there is a designer. And that is the end of our session, right? Macroevolution. If you're looking for more information, a couple books that are deeper dives. I wouldn't get these books unless you really want to go into the science behind it, but Signature into a Cell is really deep into the origin of life and DNA and proving basically through all the various natural processes that messages can't come into existence on their own, that it requires an intelligent brain. Darwin's Doubt goes deep into the Cambrian Explosion and all the other things that Darwin himself doubted about his theory. A couple other books on evolution. Darwin on Trial is the Philip Johnson one that's pretty good. Icons of Evolution goes into the things that you see in the scientific textbooks that are wrong and faulty. And then one quick slide on, there were questions we had on carbon dating, Grand Canyon, things like that. And I kind of realized they were all around the same question. Is it an old universe versus a young universe, right? And then if you look into it, both sides require assumptions, right? Old universe requires assumptions of speed of light, the in the ocean, the radioactive dating. You're making a lot of assumptions when it comes to thinking the universe is old. You're also making the same different assumptions when you think the universe is young, based on how long were the days that the Bible mentions. There is the initial creation of God created the heavens and the earth, and then a few verses later, the days start, right? So what was, there's a gap there possibly, because the Bible doesn't say what that gap is. The third day seems to be longer than 24 hours for vegetation to grow. The sixth day seems to be longer than 24 hours for Adam naming all the animals, right? How long, I don't know, maybe you could do that in a 24-hour day, I don't know. And the seventh day hasn't ended yet, right? But both sides require assumptions, but either answer doesn't matter, doesn't change anything. My personal belief is more on the young side, but with evidence of old, but that's just my personal belief. If you're interested more in the creation and the age of the universe, books I'd recommend are Navigating Genesis, 7 Worlds, 7 Days That Divide the World. I wouldn't look into this one unless you want the science behind the flaws of carbon dating and what have you, and things that I think goes into like the Grand Canyon, nuclear decay. That's very scientific, that last book. And again, people like to say, well, science can't answer everything. Science can't account for everything. Science can't account for mathematics and logic. Science can't prove them because science presupposes them. Science can't prove metaphysical truths, such as there are minds that exist other than my own. You can't prove that through science. You can't prove ethical judgments. You can't prove aesthetics. You can't prove science itself. A scientific method discovers truth, can't be proven itself by a scientific method. So there are things that science cannot prove. Some good resources, Cross-Examined. That's a good one. Dr. William Craig Lang's YouTube channel is pretty good. And that's it. The end. Opening for Q&A if there is any. Where's Q&A at tonight? Is it on YouTube? Facebook? Wesley? Which ones? Okay, but where would they post them? Oh, Facebook and YouTube? Okay, Facebook and YouTube. So we'll give it a few minutes, but thank you guys very much. She's emailing who? Emailing science teachers. All right, well, I guess we'll close it up. No questions? All right, thank you guys very much. Have a good night. Let me stop.